Welcome to today's webinar hosted by Current Consulting Group and Premier Biotech. I'm Jessica Polk of the Current Consulting Group, and I'll be conducting today's webinar entitled Putting Knowledge into Action, How to Confidently Modernize Your Drug Testing Program. And we'd like to remind those of you who are joining us today that today's presentation pre-qualifies for continuing education from HRCI and from SHRM for those who attend the entire live presentation. We'd like to thank today's sponsor, Premier Biotech. They provide customized drug screening services for their customers in criminal justice, corrections, workplace, health and human services, and clinical-based programs. Their commitment is to deliver the most innovative and flexible testing menu in drugs of abuse. We'd like to welcome today's presenters. We have with us today Brian Feely from Current Consulting Group and Dr. Jen Colby from Premier Biotech to share with us their expertise in the drug testing industry as it pertains to our topic today, putting all of this into work. Brian is the Vice President of Current Consulting Group with more than 40 years of experience in the diagnostic industry, working for companies such as Roche Diagnostics and OraSure Technologies before coming to Current Consulting Group. Brian's focus for the last 25 years has been in oral fluid diagnostic testing field. And he's considered an expert in the science, sales, and marketing of oral fluid testing. And Dr. Colby is the Chief Scientific Officer at Premier Biotech in Minneapolis, Minnesota. She received her bachelor's degree in biology from Vanderbilt University and her PhD in toxicology from UC Berkeley. Presentation over to Brian for a minute, and he's going to take us through our agenda today.
Yes, thank you, Jessica, and welcome everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you this afternoon. Thank you all for taking some time out of your afternoon to join us and participate in this great webinar. I think this has been a series of 3 different webinars. This one entitled Putting Knowledge into Action, How to Confidently Modernize Your Drug Testing Program is very relevant in today's environment, especially as we see changing laws and a lot of things going on within the drug testing field and new technologies coming out. So the whole idea of modernizing your drug testing program is right on cue. This is part of a 3-part series, the 3rd part of it, where previously the speakers talked about oral fluid testing and some of the key aspects of the importance of how to keeping your policy up to date and the importance of the different types of devices that you select. And then I think they talked a little bit about the legalities and accuracy and practicality. So I think this one is good. It should form a nice well-rounded end to this 3-part series. I'm thrilled to be doing this today with Dr. Colby, and I've known Jen for a long time, and she's definitely an expert in the toxicological aspects of drug testing and all things related to oral tox and the lab-based testing that they offer there. So welcome, Jen. If you want to say hello, make sure your mic's working.
Hey everybody, thanks Brian. It's we had a great time the last time we presented together, so I think this will be a good time.
We did.
Thank you all for joining us.
Yes, thank you, and we'll bounce back and forth. Jen and I will cover a couple of different topics here. She'll take the science one at the top and talk about oral fluid and some of the key aspects of oral fluid, as well as the regulatory clearance, demystifying that, kind of making sure people understand the difference between FDA 510K products and the new labeling that has come out, E&I, or employment and insurance risk, and there's even forensic use only. Then I'll pick up with some of the industry-specific type guidance and challenges that we see in different areas, and focus on some of those. And then I'll talk a little bit about implementing oral fluid testing, making a change, how to how to pick a good vendor, and those sort of things. So with that in mind, I believe our first order of business is to give this to Jessica for a poll question that's coming up.
Yep, absolutely. So we're going to start out today's webinar with a poll question. So if you would like to participate with this question, how would you rate your understanding of the science behind oral fluid testing? So I'll go ahead and launch that out for everyone. And if you would participate, we look forward to hearing from you. I'll just give you a few seconds to participate in that. And so, of course, your options, if you We're reading through them are excellent, good, fair, poor, I'm not sure yet. It looks like we've got some good participation and we're slowing down. So I'm going to go ahead and close this poll and share the responses with everyone. So it looks like we have 5% feel like excellent, 33% feel good, 35% feel fair, 25% poor, and 3% are not quite sure. So I'm going to hide these results again. I'm going to turn off my camera and we're going to turn the microphone and the presentation over to you, Dr. Colby.
Fantastic. It sounds like at least some percentage of the attendees will hopefully learn something new in the Understanding the Science section here. So I always want to start by talking about what oral fluid is. So it is saliva, but it's more than saliva. So everyone knows we have salivary glands and they're constantly producing saliva, which we are constantly then swallowing, right? So there's this recirculation process happening all day, every day. Saliva is one component of oral fluid, but oral fluid contains pretty much anything that's been in the mouth. So that can be things like food or anything that was, for example, smoked or drunk, or if there is toothpaste, or, you know, the list goes on and on. So pretty much anything that's been in your mouth can end up in your oral fluid. So it is saliva, but it's saliva plus. And one of the cool things about it as a sample for drug testing is that it's constantly being replenished. And so every about 10-ish minutes, you've completely replaced the oral fluid that's in your mouth. And that's great if you're interested in detecting something that's happened fairly recently. Drugs can end up in oral fluid in a couple of different ways. One way is that drugs can enter by diffusion from the bloodstream. So you can think about one of the jobs of the salivary glands is to produce the saliva, but they do that kind of by filtering the blood. So all the big components of blood stay behind in the capillaries, but the liquid and the small molecules like drugs can pass through into the saliva. So you can see, this is most common with therapeutic drugs, but you can detect them in oral fluid even though they may not have been administered orally. So that's one mechanism. The other mechanism, and this is the one that is, I think, perhaps the most relevant in the context of detecting drugs of abuse, is that drugs are just deposited in the mouth, the oral cavity, when they're being used. And that includes things that are smoked or vaped or insufflated, snorted. There's a lot of ways to get oral contamination. What that does is create a pretty large depot of drug in the user's mouth, which is really convenient if we're trying to detect use in general. So there typically is high concentrations. That can even apply to some drugs that are administered as like a dissolving strip. So that would apply to things like buprenorphine, for example. You can get very, very high concentrations in the mouth. So it's great for detection. It can be challenging to interpret in the context of impairment, though, because when the drug has been used orally, the blood concentration may not correlate with the oral fluid concentration anymore. So it's a bit of a double-edged sword there. Those of you who already have a good understanding of oral fluid will know the answer to this question, but for those of you who are just sort of starting your oral fluid journey, it's important to understand the concept of metabolism. So drugs, when they are taken, are typically in an active form. And we often refer to the active drug as the parent drug. And it's the parent because after the body acts on that drug, it produces a metabolite. So the parent drug is what you take. The metabolite is what gets produced after your liver actually acts on the drug. And the goal of that whole metabolism process is to make drugs easier to excrete. And that's typically through the urine, although there are other mechanisms. And the key point here is that parent drugs tend to be active and metabolites tend to be inactive. It's not universally true, there's always exceptions, but in general, that statement holds. So what the diagram is showing is two active drugs, fentanyl and delta-9 THC, which is of course the active psychoactive component, one of them in cannabis, and then on the right, the metabolites of those two compounds. So the one thing I want to point out here is that oral fluid typically contains parent drug. And a lot of that is because the drugs are entering the mouth at the time at which they're used. Urine, on the other hand, largely contains inactive metabolites, and that point will become important later on. We can collect oral fluid samples several different ways. The low-tech way is just passive drooling into a collection container. That is understandably no one's favorite approach, although we probably all did it a time or two during COVID, those early COVID tests. But there are also specialized collection devices. And there's a couple of example collection devices shown on the right of the screen. Some of these have preservative solutions to stabilize the sample during transport. The collection apparatus itself can be made of a variety of different materials. Some manufacturers actually use a special treatment on their collection pad to stimulate salivation. You know, if you think about eating something really sour, you can kind of get your salivary glands going. It's a similar concept to that. So that sort of helps make sure that you have a sufficient volume of oral fluid to do the actual sample collection. And then, you know, another option is just a sort of a sponge that is collected into an applicator, which is shown on the bottom. They can be natural material, man-made material, all sorts of different things. So there's lots of different options where collection devices are concerned. One of the best things, the most advantageous things about oral fluid is that the collections are directly observed by whomever is administering the test, which is fantastic because that can be sort of gender agnostic, and because the collection is being observed, it's very difficult to beat an oral fluid test. After the sample's collected, we talk about the test process. So what I'm showing you here is two rapid devices. There's a urine device on the left and then an oral fluid device, the oral tox, on the right. You can see that the strips that are in those rapid tests look pretty similar. And from a technical perspective, they work the exact same way. The chemistries are very similar. Probably the key difference is that in the urine test, the tests are targeted to metabolites of drugs. And on the oral fluid test, they're targeted towards those psychoactive parent compounds. But the strips function the exact same way. Just like anybody would recommend that a presumptive positive or a non-negative, depending on your preferred terminology, a urine result would go to a laboratory for confirmation. The same holds true for an oral fluid rapid test or a lab-based screen. Confirmatory testing is the gold standard, and the confirmatory testing that's performed in oral fluid works exactly the same as the confirmatory testing in urine. We use the same exact equipment, the same kinds of tools, and the same sort of rigor in the analysis. So other than the collection and the actual sort of composition of the sample, it's apples and apples as far as the testing process goes. Oops, went too far. So from a laboratory perspective, the labs that are performing testing in oral fluid or urine for forensic or other sort of legal-oriented situations, those labs typically have accreditation from a variety of different accrediting agencies, but the majority of those agencies accredit without regard to the specific sample type. Again, there are exceptions, but for the most part, the laboratory agrees to perform testing in accordance with the standards. They get inspected, and all of the rigor that's applied to urine inspection would also be applied to an oral fluid inspection. So from the confirmed result perspective, the weight given to a urine result or an oral fluid result would be the same. And speaking for our own laboratory, we have a CAP, Forensic Drug Testing accredited laboratory in Minneapolis, and we regularly go to court to support proceedings that involve our device results and our confirmed results from our laboratory. If you're in workplace testing, you're probably familiar with SAMHSA and HHS and their release, it's been a while now, 2019, so a few years have passed, but their recent release of oral fluid guidelines for regulated drug testing. And there's a lot of reasons that they moved in this direction, but I think some of the big ones are the opportunity for enhanced flexibility and the need to not have dedicated restrooms and reducing the need for observed collection. Also, I think there will be a reduction in invalid tests because you don't have issues where people are able to subvert. Also, collections are faster, and oral fluid is really quite good at detecting recent drug use. So a lot of reasons to move in this direction. DOT also jumped on the oral fluid bandwagon with their additional sort of collection-oriented guidelines with some similar rationales. So a lot of it is reducing the opportunity for adulteration or substitution. There's some cost savings with not needing to have a dedicated collection site. And again, the sort of focus on recent use detection and the relatively shorter window of detection that oral fluid has compared to something like urine. So I wanted to sort of end the science section with this quote, which I think a lot of folks in the oral fluid business like to use because it really speaks to the science supporting oral fluid testing. This quote comes from the preamble in the mandatory guidelines. And the SAMHSA drug testing program is widely regarded as the gold standard in employment testing. They do a really fabulous job. And what they said in their introduction to their guidelines is the scientific basis for the use of oral fluid as an alternative specimen for drug testing has now been broadly established. And the advances in the use of oral fluid in detecting drugs have made it possible for this alternative specimen to be used in federal programs with the same level of confidence that has been applied to the use of urine. So basically, they came out strong and said oral fluid is as good as urine. With that, we're going to kind of pivot away from science and talk a little bit about the regulatory framework for testing in general and rapid testing also specifically. So we want to start by talking about what a 510K is. So an FDA 510K is a pre-market submission that basically the manufacturer of a test or a device sends all of their information to the FDA and they say, our device performs like some other device that's already legally marketed. And the idea would be that the FDA then has the opportunity to review all of the data that's been collected, review the accuracy, the performance, all the manufacturer's validation information, product stability, everything. And then they have an opportunity to approve that device for marketing and subsequent sale. Now, historically, drug testing devices, rapid devices would have fallen into a 510K category as class 2 devices. As we will talk about, there are some exceptions to that rule now, although there are still plenty of FDA 510K cleared rapid tests for drugs, predominantly urine. But the idea of a 510K is that it's really a gold standard because you've gone through a very rigorous process to collect clinical trial data showing that your device actually works or showing that your test actually does what you say it does. And you've compiled all that and you've had it reviewed by an external body. So there's a lot of work that goes into that, and it's an indicator of high quality. Again, in 2019, the FDA actually created 2 alternate pathways. We're focusing on one of them here, which is the employment and insurance pathway. So basically what this allowed was for manufacturers to use very specific labeling language stating that a test was for use in employment and insurance testing only. And if they did that, then they did not have to go down the 510K pathway, which is long and arduous and expensive. So this employment and insurance exemption actually allowed manufacturers to bring tests to market much more quickly. The good things about it, everybody gets access to new tests more quickly, and the manufacturers are still held to quality standards in terms of their manufacturing practices. But the piece that is not included is the FDA actually reviewing the data that supports how the test performs. So the manufacturer generates it, but there isn't an external review piece involved. So what this basically does is gives users access to devices faster, and makes them reliant on the manufacturer's testing to demonstrate how the device actually works in a real life use case. So clearance matters, for understanding test performance characteristics. Is it you've met the FDA standards or you've met the manufacturer's standards? Both labelings would produce a device that meets basic quality principles and good manufacturing practices. Depending on what your use case is, a 510K labeled device might be required. There are states where that's the case, also some test programs that mandate a 510K cleared device only. But I think the bottom line and sort of the point I want to make here is that both 510K cleared and E&I labeled devices are good devices. The 510K is maybe an extra special gold star. Maybe it's the gold standard, but that doesn't mean that the E&I devices don't have value. Oops, went too far. Okay, that's it for the regulatory section. So I will pop off camera and hand this over to Brian to go ahead and talk about the industry-specific guidance.
Okay, can you hear me? Good. I assume yes. This section is going to talk a little bit about different industries and the guidance that you typically see in those industries, and also some of the challenges. And I think when you look at one of the big challenges today that employers struggle with is really the costs associated with substance use or abuse in the workplace. And I've seen this number vary, actually to even be quite a bit higher than 81 billion, but drug abuse costs employers about 80 or more billion dollars a year, which is a huge number when you think about it. And the types of areas that are involved there is lost work, healthcare costs, lost productivity. So lost productivity in and of itself is, and absenteeism at work is in the range of about 25 billion. Healthcare costs associated with drug abuse are estimated at 25 billion, in that range. And then you have workplace theft. So one of the things that substance use and substance abusers will tend to do is steal from their workplace, and they use that as a means to buy their drugs and their substances that they want to abuse, and that's a big issue. And I think that today, while we talk about this number, it's estimated that 70% of the Americans who use illegal drugs are currently employed. We've talked about that for a long time. The thing that's starting to come into play here is also with the legalization of marijuana and how widely available it is, and even legal in many states. We now see some startling and scary statistics starting to come out about the substance abuse prior to work and during the workday. So this is a survey that it's not on the screen here, but the survey was done about a year and a half, 2 years ago with individuals who use cannabis. And the question posed at no risk to them, and there was no ramifications, was what is your cannabis use or your THC marijuana use habits relative to the workday? And startlingly enough, 77% of those people said they use before they go to work. And scarier maybe is the fact that 48% admitted to using drugs while at work, either on a break or when they go to lunch or whatever the case may be. So these add to the challenges that we're seeing today in the workplace. And then you have the actual impairment issues. And so National Safety did a survey last year, the year before, I think this data was from. 52% of those respondents stated that impairment is decreasing the safety in their workplace. and 43 respondents claim the impairment has increased workers' compensation costs. So, all this data, even down the bottom, 36% of the respondents indicated that impairment is a problem in their workplace. So we're seeing it, people are aware of it, and they need to find a way to deal with it. And so while, as Jennifer was talking about before, Jen was mentioning it's not an impairment test, the one cool thing about oral fluid is that it's really good at detecting recent use, which we'll talk about in a slide or a couple of slides coming up. So if you're really looking to detect something that you suspect someone is using when they got to work, or they went out to break and they came back looking like a different person and maybe smelling like a different person, an oral fluid test is a great way to go, because it's going to tell you what's in their system right there and then. So a number of these slides, we're going to talk about requirements for testing and selecting a testing device, and then even selecting a vendor. So areas to consider when you're dealing with the testing requirements depend upon what kind of a business you run. Federal guidance, of course, comes into play if you're a federal employee or you have contracts that are federal. There are state laws that guide both the voluntary and the mandatory laws within your state, and each state is very different depending upon where you are, and that's all the more reason to really make sure you're doing addendums in your policy so that you cover the state laws. Case law also comes into play. So sometimes there isn't a mandatory law, there isn't clear guidance from the statutory standpoint, but there's case law. California, for example, does not have a mandatory law, but they have a ton of case law. And so what that means is if you are a provider or you're an employer that's doing drug testing, you kind of need to be aware of some of that case law, especially if you fall into the same category as others that may have been involved in filing that case law or trying to adjudicate it. There are local ordinances, like in certain cities, they have some of their own guidance, and there's a hierarchy of how this goes, which we'll talk about. But at the end of the day, it's the company policy that guides all this, and it should include your overall program. If there's a federal component, it needs to include that. A DOT component, a driver, someone that might be under a rail or a pipeline, those need to be included in addition to your non-regulated employees. And that's so the policy becomes really the blueprint for your company, and really needs to include the right stuff. In the construction industry, very specific area, very safety sensitive oriented. You'll often have both the federal guidelines coming into play for people that might be CDL drivers or are involved in large trucks and moving materials and earth and machines. You have the Drug-Free Workplace Act of '88 coming into play. OSHA, of course, is a big deal in the construction industry. Americans with Disability Act, the National Labor Relations Act. So all these things are part of the federal laws and programs you need to be considering. And then you have your state laws that includes things like workers' comp and marijuana laws, keeping up on things like the legalization. Not only that, but also the medical marijuana issue, because in different states, medical marijuana will have accommodations in some areas that you have to be careful of. In other areas, there are no accommodations for someone with a medical marijuana card, but they come into play. There are some specific state testing procedures you need to be aware of, and even limitations to the reason that you're conducting a test. In some cases, you can only do pre-employment with a certain type of test. In other cases, you can't even do certain types of tests. They may be prohibited. And so it's all part of that puzzle that you need to be aware of. Construction is really important because of the safety sensitive nature of it. And I think oral fluid, just as an aside, plays a nice role here, because in the construction industry, typically they've got people waiting, in some cases in the morning, to get site entrance, to get into a facility, to take on a new project. And they could have lines that are where they're dealing with training, and they're handing out hard hats, and they're doing orientations. And a rapid oral fluid test, if they're doing drug testing at that site, which many of them do, is a great way to deal with that backlog of people coming through that facility. You get the test done. If it's negative, they move on to the next stage. If it's positive, then you pull that off and you go for a confirmation test. Again, company policy is big here. making sure that you're covering the right things for your particular business if you're in the construction field. Healthcare, many of the same issues with ADA and HIPAA and OSHA, even SAMHSA, but you also have state laws that can be very specific toward the healthcare area, and in terms of what you can do and the permitted type of testing. And certainly the panels can be very specific and broader in the healthcare area. Typically, you're having professionals that have access to things like the opioids and fentanyl and a variety of other things. So you typically want to try to make sure that a medical screening program for the healthcare area covers the things that people are going to have access to, both pre-employment and then on the job. And then transportation, the guidance here is really well set in the federally mandated program 49 CFR Part 40. Whether it's the aviation group or the rail or transit or federal motor carriers or pipeline, et cetera, they all are part of that DOT program, and they all have specific. They all go by that specific program that governs how they need to conduct drug testing. There are some differences here and there, but by and large, they're all subject to that program. And over on the far right is an idea of what kind of drivers or what type of people are involved in those different areas, whether it's rail track maintenance or transit folks. They're all part of that overall program. And then there are other industries that come into play. Retail, for example, while it's often not safety sensitive, it can also be very much important that you have a good program in place, because you have workers that are exposed to the public, and they're working with the public, whether they're at a cash register or they're in sales or they're doing something in the retail area. It can't be an area, it shouldn't be an area where people say, we don't need to drug test because it's retail. That's just not the case. Again, theft is one of the big issues, adding costs to the overall system, and retail is probably the top area for where theft can occur. We were talking about construction, hospitality, and both retail and hospitality are really good areas for, again, an instant test where you're getting people through the system quick. You do a rapid test, and pretty much on the spot if you've got somebody that you can onboard and take to the next step, and even potentially even start that day or that week. You have other areas like the Ubers and all those DoorDashes, so many different things now today that involve drivers. It's important they have a good program. Manufacturing, very important, et cetera. So, again, tying back to the policy, the program, the area that you're in, the industry that you're in, you just need to make sure that your policy and your program covers all the different aspects of the business that you're in, the states that you're in, and that you have addendums and that they're well covered. The testing scenarios are covered, and you really got a program that's buttoned up and will hold up well if there ever were a challenge in a court by an employee. So that's that section. I'm going to turn this back to Jessica for a moment to do this particular poll.
Great, thanks so much, Brian. And we're going to just go ahead and start our next poll. Which factor most drives your workplace drug testing policy today? Federal guidance, state and local laws and ordinances, workers' compensation requirements, industry client contract requirements, or others. So you want to help us with that information, go ahead and participate in this poll. Again, federal guidance, state and local laws or ordinances, workers' comp insurance requirements, industry client contract requirements, or other. And it looks like we're slowing down, so I'll go ahead and share those responses with us. We have 45% said federal guidance, 12% state or local laws, 12% workers' comp insurance requirements, 26% said industry client and or contract requirements, and 5% said other. And so I will take this back.
Okay, so that was interesting data. A lot of folks on the call certainly have regulated components to their workplace, along with many others. So this section, I think, is kind of interesting because it really deals with the implementation part. So you've gone through a lot of learning over the last couple of webinars. This one on the science and on some of the challenges and the different industries in terms of how things that you need to think about. This is kind of geared toward what do I need to do to get started? What do I need to do to select the right drug test and the right vendor? And so, you know, first the slide on really what motivates companies to do drug testing to begin with, right? According to our survey in 2024, every year we have 2 surveys. One is for the providers in the industry and the other is for employers. And we ask a whole bunch of questions. And this was co-sponsored by Premier Biotech, this particular survey. And, you know, 85% said that it's really to promote workplace safety, which is not surprising. It seems like a no-brainer. But it's really good to see that that still is important to people. It's the core of why they do it. It's the core of the benefits they see from drug testing, and so that's top of the heap. Now, of course, you have people that have to comply with their regulations. 51% though, this is really nice to see. At least half of the people, they want to hire the best people for the job, and so it's important for them to get good people with good reputations because typically they're gonna stand the test of time, and I'm not going to have to refill that position because of some issue related to substance abuse or another problem that they might have. 49% minimize legal risks, right? Because if you don't do it, you could stand to be liable for things that occur in the workplace that you should have known about. There's a couple of doctrines that relate to that, respondent superior, and then another one is, you know, if you should have known that someone had an issue where they, you know, it walks like a duck, quacks like a duck, you know, they're clear substance abuse issue and you did nothing about it to test them, to screen them, then you could be held liable for something that occurs in your workplace. 45% that comply with the federal regulations, et cetera. So these are the things that motivate, and they're all really important. When you start to look at the different types of drug tests out there, there's a wide variety, right, in terms of sample type, and some detect recent use and some look at longer lifestyle, and then some will give you immediate results or you have to send it to a lab. Some focus on really, you know, when you're selecting a test, it's really about the bottom line to some folks, and you know, sadly that sometimes is the case, we get it, but really when you look at the cost of a drug test and you look at the cost involved in an employee that's involved in substance abuse, or what that costs an employer, I think the number is in the $7,000 to $8,000 a year range for the various things that are involved with that. Some of the things we talked about earlier. When you look at the cost of a drug test, it's a drop in the bucket compared to, and what that could also cost your company in terms of reputation, it's really small. So bottom line, you know, from my standpoint, and I think those that really follow the industry, that should not be your top focus in other words, the cost of the test should really not be your focus. Is it required? Who's it required by? And then you get into things like reasons for testing, the method that you're going to use, and really what are your program objectives. And you have to think about your overall needs when it comes to why you're testing. And so that whole concept of lab versus point of care or point of collection testing is, do I need a rapid test? Is that going to help me with my onboarding? Is it going to help people get on the job quicker? May be higher than the fact that, you know, you've got more time to hire someone, and a lab-based test that comes back 2 or 3 days later is not a big deal. So those considerations are really important. The panels, of course, the accuracy of the test, and looking at the state laws to figure out where do I need a device that's got an actual FDA clearance versus one that might be E&I labeled. The window of detection we're going to talk about in a second. Then of course marijuana, the what seems to be, you know, currently in the news and in our minds in the drug testing field. But for employers, how do I test for it? Which methods do I use? And is there a good overall return on the investment? I think that's all very important, and thinking through the different methods and the challenges that you have, you can basically solve those if you pick the right type of method in the right environment, you know, for the different types of employees that you have in your workplace. Of course, there are 4 or 5 different main areas of testing: your pre-employment, random, for cause or reasonable suspicion. Those terms are used kind of intermittently. Post-accident return to duty and even follow-up. And the testing scenarios, depending upon who's involved for pre-hire or post-hire, HR and talent management, or your recruiting and staffing, and et cetera, safety management and your post-hire, all need to be part of the program and part of helping to select the right test, making sure it's really going to work well for you. But really, when you look at oral tox, it's really a great choice for those high turnover hiring events, getting people on the job quick, and even the safety concerns, again, because it ties well to recent use. And somebody that's comes up positive in an oral fluid test, particularly for marijuana, they're using it right there on the spot, or maybe the night before, but typically it's that same day. So the different types of samples, I think this was already stated a little bit by Jen, but or urine and oral fluid, hair, those are the three top ones. Blood is typically not used so much in the workplace market, unless there's an accident and someone has to go to the hospital, and then they could be drawing blood to look at the toxicology. And then the different types, there's the rapid test, sometimes called POCT, or the laboratory-based test. So this is another key thing in really selecting the right drug test, is knowing a little something about the window of detection. And one size doesn't need to fit all anymore. There used to be urine testing for years and years and years, and there really weren't too many other options. Now there are options, and it's important to really look at those and make sure that you're covering what you're most interested in your program. Historical use, when you look at this chart, you'll see hair testing is way out to the right, because it really is not looking at what's in your system today. What did you do before work this morning? It's looking at what did you do a month ago, or 2 months ago, or 3 months ago. So it's really used by people who care about that historic use aspect. They're going back and it may be a casino or financial organization or some of those types of industries like the hair test, but trucking industry tends to like it too for that long-term indicator. And you can combine these different types of tests. You don't have to just select one. You might use oral fluid for your pre-hire and getting people on the job quick, and reasonable suspicion and post-accident, but you might use hair testing for other indications, and even urine screening. And so that's what the window of detection is all about. And that oral fluid piece, kind of in the middle, is where you're going to pick up a substance right away after someone used it, out to about a day and a half, 2 days maybe. With THC, especially with a rapid test, you're really looking at that 8-hour, 10-hour window that most correlates with the workday use, and that's really important, especially in states where marijuana is legalized, or you're dealing with medical marijuana situation. Where that can come into play from a state law standpoint, selecting a drug test, you need to be aware of this too. In California and Washington, both passed laws that went into effect at the beginning of last year. And because it's legal in the state, both of these laws are really protecting the rights of the employee, that you're not picking them up on what they did, for the weekend or when they were on vacation. And so you're really looking at testing for that psychoactive form of the drug, not the non-psychoactive metabolite that Jen talked about before of cannabis. That's really more of an indicator of what you're going to see with a urine test. And so in the states of California and Washington, for those stated reasons, either pre-hire and post-hire in the case of California, you really can't do urine screening and take action on people anymore. You really need to look at oral fluid, because it's detecting the parent drug, the psychoactive form, and it means that you'll be compliant with those laws. And we expect you're going to see more of this as time goes on, especially in states where marijuana is legal, which is slowly or quickly, depending upon how you're looking at it, becoming the reality that eventually we're going to see all the states probably having legal marijuana use. So selecting a vendor, these are things that are guidelines from us, and the things that I've been through in 30+ years in the drug testing field in our business. Really looking at the history of them serving the drug testing area. Are they brand new? You never heard of them before, no one else ever heard of them? Have caution. Are they been around for a lot of years? They have a history of serving the drug testing market? That's a good thing. Do they understand your needs in your program? When you start talking about a rapid test, or you start talking about cutoffs or things that relate to, you know, what's allowed in certain states and not, they should know that or have access to that information. Do they have the right products or panel for your program? Do they have the right labeling, whether, as Jen talked about, FDA versus, you know, the E&I labeling? Does the vendor have referrals they can put you in touch with that support the use of the product, and are they responsive to your overall needs? And, you know, I could just sort of tell you from the time that I was at OraSure, I spent 26 years there, and we screened Premier Biotech because we adopted their oral tox product for our sales team to sell. And we primarily sold lab-based oral fluid testing. And we adopted the Premier Biotech oral tox product because we like them as a provider, but we really also liked the test. It met all of our needs. So that's important. Updating the policy, just, you know, really being clear on prohibited behaviors, drug testing, who you're going to test, for what reasons, the consequences of policy violations, and the fact that you know, make sure there's clear guidance around the things like possessing, using, or being under the influence of marijuana. And again, as I said before, make sure that you have state addendums, because that's really important. Train and beginning testing. So how does oral fluid testing affect your supervisors, managers? That's a question you have to ask. What training is required for on-site testing and collections? What training is needed when sending samples to a lab if you're going that route? And then what training is needed when you're using the point of care product or point of collection rapid result test? Of course, and updating your policy. So with that, I'll turn this back to Jessica for the poll number 3 question.
Great, thank you so much. What matters most to you when selecting a drug test? So we'll go ahead and launch that poll now. So your options are accuracy, speed, and/or turnaround time, have a wide variety of panel options, FDA 510K clearance, or cost effectiveness and/or ROI. So we appreciate your participation. We'll give you a few seconds to join us with this. And we're slowing down, so I'll go ahead and share those results. So it says 65% say accuracy, 38% speed and/or turnaround time, 20% have a wide variety of panel options, 10% FDA 510K clearance, 23% cost effectiveness and ROI. So we'll go ahead and hide those results, and I'll turn this back over to our presenters.
Okay. We've got one final section, and for those of you who have stuck around with us this far, thank you. This will be a very brief summary, and for those of you who have attended the first couple of webinars in this series, it may be a bit of a review. But in case we have any new folks, some of the key takeaways from what we've discussed today is that there are a bunch of advantages for oral fluid testing. Collections are easy, fast, difficult to subvert due to their directly observed nature. We can detect drug use very quickly after it's happened, and we can detect it in general for a shorter duration of time since use than with something like a urine test. So it's oral fluid test is a good marker for recent use. And depending on where you're located, as Brian was just mentioning, oral fluid might be the only specimen that you can test if you're interested in testing for THC. Now, everybody knows that Premier Biotech has an oral fluid device, and I want to give you sort of the science pitch on why our device is a good solution. So we have our oral tox device, which is FDA 510K cleared for 8 drugs. So that means that we've done the whole 9 yards. We've done all the clinical studies. We have data that you can pull off the internet. You can review from the FDA what we submitted to them, studies showing accuracy and precision and how that device actually performs. So that's all available for you as a user to look at. And I think that speaks to our effort and our focus on quality. Our test is fast, and we have a really slick app called OT Scan that pairs with our device, and that OT Scan app will actually simplify some of the parts of point of collection testing that have traditionally been more difficult to implement. So that's things like having subjective reads on the device, is it a line or is it not a line? Depends who's looking. And also recording the results. So that OT Scan app reads result off the oral tox device. It interprets it using a proprietary algorithm, and then it sends those results either to our portal for you to access or to an applicant tracking system through some kind of integration. So we have multiple different things set up. And then one of the things I think is the coolest about our solution is that if you get a non-negative result off that initial oral tox device, you can actually send the device directly to our laboratory, and we will extract the oral fluid and perform confirmatory testing on that same sample. So you don't have to go back and get a second sample. And if you're using our OT Scan app, that confirmatory process can actually be facilitated straight through the app. So we've tried to make this a really seamless experience for the user. And I think it's a pretty cool thing. And so with that, just a summary of why rapid oral fluid and the oral tox device in our OT Scan app can help. We can get you to have a faster hiring process, get more efficient drug testing, have better return on your investment of drug testing dollars, can help you reduce lost productivity from people hanging out at collection sites or people waiting for test results. We can improve workplace safety, detection of recent THC use, and generally we can just enhance the experience that your candidates or your employees have with drug testing just through our sort of entirely cohesive environment. There are oodles of people at Premier who know far more about how this actually gets set up and implemented than I do. And so if you're interested, I would encourage you to reach out. We've got all of our contact information on the next slide. And with that, thank you for hanging out with us. Hopefully you learned something interesting. I did see questions popping up, so I'm excited to kind of pivot on over.
Yeah, absolutely. Go ahead,
Brian. Time is a little tight, but I think the one thing that you can probably comment on, Jen, and I can probably chime in as well. There was a couple of different questions about the accuracy and reliability of a point of collection test versus a lab-based test. So, in my opinion, those are very much they're related to the cutoffs that are used, and they're related to overall sensitivity and specificity. But go ahead and give your answer on that if you would.
Yeah, absolutely. I think for a rapid test, there's two components. One is the actual physical test itself, and the other is the user. And I think using a reader has been shown to improve how the tests actually perform because it is less subjective than the human eye. So that's one point. And then in terms of the actual performance of the test, most point of collection tests, when you're doing a clinical study, you're comparing it to another lab-based test. We don't typically, in a trial situation, compare point of collection to lab-based screen, but both of those would be compared independently to that confirmatory test. So what I would say is that point of collection tests tend to have higher cutoffs than lab-based tests. And so depending on whether you're optimizing for sensitivity or not, you may choose one or the other. But point of collection tests also have some advantages over lab tests. So lab tests, you can have analytical problems with very high samples and then subsequent samples testing positive. Again, that gets sorted out in the confirmatory process, but in a point of collection test, it's single-use device, right? So you never have to worry about things like that. So I think that there are some advantages, and in terms of overall accuracy, most point of collection drug tests that I'm familiar with perform somewhere between 95 and 99% accuracy as compared to the gold standard LCMS.
Yeah, no, I would agree absolutely. And So, and there's a lot to that question when you start to get into the individual drugs and what about the differences that you sometimes see with marijuana. But yeah, by and large, that's right. We always found the detection rates of the point of collection tests to be very accurate with mass spec. Just assuming you're looking at apples to apples in terms of the cutoffs. A question came up with fentanyl and the addition of that to the federal guidelines. In case people didn't realize this, over the last year, the HHS has implemented this and has made it part of the SAMHSA guidelines actually. So as of, I guess it was July when it became effective, you have to include fentanyl in your federal testing program. Now the DOT hasn't adopted that yet. They haven't created the notice of proposed rulemaking, and so it's not part of the DOT regulated program yet, I don't believe, but it's coming, and you know, or it may be coming. So just a heads up, if you're in a federal program and you're not testing for fentanyl, it is required. Your lab should be doing that for you, and your provider should be giving you guidance as such.
I think they actually did publish the notice of proposed rulemaking. I think that was in September.
Yeah, for the DOT.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think they asked for some comments back, and I know comments were provided.
Yeah, and so I don't know what the implementation timeline looks like, but.
Jess, I know we're up against the hour here. Is there any one quick one that we can answer in addition to what was in there?
I think you guys have done a good job of covering it. One of the questions that we have was this is for Jen. You talked a lot about marijuana, but how well does oral fluid detect other impairing drugs like opiates and even multi-drug use? I think this kind of spins off that fentanyl question a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, each strip or each test would be independent. And for drugs that are smoked, I mean, fentanyl's a great example. When used medically, right, it's usually transdermal or an injection, but when used recreationally, it's usually smoked. So you're getting tons of that contaminating the oral fluid. So actually, in our laboratory, our oral fluid fentanyl cutoff is significantly higher than what HHS and DOT are proposed to use, and we see a ton of positives. So I think there's a lot of opportunity to detect drugs in oral fluid, particularly when they are either taken orally or smoked.
Very interesting. Well, wonderful. We're at the top of the hour, and I know this has been a very insightful and informative presentation. We want to thank those of you who have joined today's webinar presentation. If you were interested, this presentation was recorded and we will be sending out the link to the recording. So if you want to review this information again, take a look at those slides again, you can do that through the recording. And then of course, if you have any questions for today's presenters that weren't answered, please feel free to reach out to Brian or to Jen with the information that's currently on the slide. For those who attended the entire 1 hour, you have qualified for a continuing education credit from SHRM and from HRCI, and we'll email you those credit codes out so that you don't have to worry about it. Just look for that email. And with that, this concludes today's webinar presentation, and we hope you all have a wonderful